Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about evidence, examples, and appeals. Basically, all the different types of support that, well, not all of the different types of support, but the types of support that your textbook talks about for supporting your argument. So we're going to take a few notes. So have a paper and pen ready, or have a Word document open on your computer. This is specifically from Inventing Arguments textbook, chapter 3. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is types of evidence. Evidence as support. So some different types of evidence are using authorities. So if you're talking about climate change, you obviously want to reference an authority on climate change. Testimony. So any story, personal story that personal experience you can say. For example, if you are doing the climate change topic and you've worked with climate change initiatives, then that would be a testimony because it's your personal experience. And then also we have facts and statistics. So these are the main types of evidence that you can use. And evidence is going to be the backbone of factual presentation of information, whereas examples is more of a support to these evidence pieces. All right, so some characteristics of evidence. Evidence already exists. You don't have to research it. You're not the researcher. You don't go out and have a personal experience. You already have personal experience. Evidence does not require further support because it stands alone as, a fact or a statistic or personal experience. Okay? Evidence is often identified by an appositive phrase. And I'm going to show you what that is. I'm writing it down here. All right, I'm going to do that on the next board, the appositive phrases. So evidence already exists, does not require further support, and often is identified with appositive phrases, which I'm going to show you what this means on the next note board. Okay. All right, so what is an appositive phrase? It's actually a grammatical term. And it's where you rename the subject of a sentence. So an example is Professor Smith, distinguished teaching professor of biology, at Harvard, argues blah, blah, blah. So let me show you what I mean here. And a positive phrase renames the subject. So, so Professor Smith is the subject, and then we rename that subject by giving a description. So we do comma, put the appositive phrase in there, and then end comma, and continue the sentence. So Professor Smith, comma, distinguished teaching professor of bio at Harvard. This little appositive phrase is super important because it's like, okay, number one, a distinguished teaching professor has a lot of experience and a lot of awards and research. And number two, it's Harvard University. So of course, we're going to assume that this person is an expert at their topic. If we just said Professor Smith, that wouldn't be the same power in convincing an audience member of something than if we use the appositive. So appositives are, you can use them for anything. Like if you had a book you were referencing, you could say um, the title of the book, and then you'd put a comma, and you'd put the number one published bestseller in the New York Times, comma, and then continue your sentence. So it's basically just giving a little bit more information about the subject of your sentence. Okay. Now, let's see here. Like I said before, evidence does not require further explanation or support. So if you give a statistic, you can explain how the statistic applies to your thesis, but that statistic in and of itself stands alone as a fact. Excuse me. Okay, the next thing your textbook talks about, besides evidence, is examples. So remember, evidence is more of the fact-based support, whereas examples are going to be specific occurrences of a phenomenon. So you might reference some specific examples from the past to prove your present argument. You might give a scenario that presents a specific occurrence of a phenomenon that hasn't happened yet. Let me give you some examples of example. One is allusions. And hopefully you know that allusions are references to usually common knowledge from history. And it relies heavily, like this is only going to work using allusions if your audience already knows what you're talking about. So for example, if you say, well, an eye for an eye, that's an allusion. That's an allusion to a biblical moral in the book of Leviticus. And not everyone might know what that means, but we do say it as common knowledge. Okay. You might use allusion to, allude to Shakespeare. Or if you said 9/11, for example, that's an allusion. That depends on your audience understanding what you mean when you say 9/11. Hopefully, you all know what that means as an allusion to 9/11, the tragedy, September 11th. So when you refer to things without explaining them, like saying 9/11, for example, that's an allusion because you're relying on the audience already knowing what you're talking about. All right, another type of example is an anecdote. Anecdotes are short accounts of a particular event or incident. Anecdotes are like from someone else's point of view, not from yours. Because if it was from your point of view, then it would be a testimony, which is evidence. Anything that's personal experience is going to have more power in an argument than an anecdote. An anecdote is like a second person account. So anytime a journalist does an interview and puts a quote in their article, that's an anecdote because it's a story from somebody else. Okay. Too bad I don't have a huge whiteboard behind me. That would be really helpful. Okay, another really important type of example is an illustration. Illustrations are really important in argument because it affects the brain a different way. So we know that illustrations are graphic descriptions of a particular idea, like a bar graph or a pie chart or a photo. And it's important to provide these because, like I said, visuals affect the brain differently than auditory or just reading. So when you're writing a research paper, illustrations are an important component that you should definitely feel free to put in your paper. Just make sure that your paper is still the right length or word count, even if you're using graphics. Okay, another and the final type of example we're going to talk about is scenarios. So the difference between anecdote and scenario is that an anecdote is a story from someone else. So, like, basically a personal experience from someone else that you are using in your argument. Um, but a scenario is something that you make up, where you're telling the audience, imagine if such and such happened, how would you feel? Or what would you do? Or what steps of action would you take? So we use scenarios a lot in our everyday language to get people to picture or think about the other side, even if they've never had an experience with that other side. So, for example, I might have already told you this, but I use scenario all the time when I'm disciplining my children. Let's say my son pulls my daughter's hair. I'll say, imagine if Selah pulled your hair, how would you feel? And we talk about the implications of hurting someone else through scenario instead of actually allowing my daughter to pull his hair or something. I say, imagine if, and make him think about how that might feel. So, scenarios, like I said, are definitely used in my everyday life, constantly telling my kids, imagine if blah, 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 right? Imagine if you didn't have a mom that cooked you a nice dinner, right? To get them to feel something. And I'm hoping that they feel some sort of guilt or gratefulness when I say something like that. So we use scenarios all the time to get people to feel a particular way. So scenarios have not happened, have not actually happened. Scenarios are often used in when someone is speaking from some sort of political platform or moral platform. So, for example, let's say you're giving a speech on gun control. You might have a story, an imagine if story for, let's say, your audience is parents or guardians. You might have an imagine if scenario for a school shooter or violence in the community and specifically your child. So getting the audience to think about that seriously might change their mind, right? If you get a parent to picture something terrible related to guns, they might be willing to change their mind and, side with you if your view is more about promoting more gun control, right? On the other side of that, if you are, I just lost my train of thought. Scenarios. Oh, of the gun control. So on the other side of that, let's say you are a proponent of less restrictive gun control, then you might have a scenario where you're trying to convince the audience of why it's important for someone to have a gun, right? Imagine if somebody broke into your home and you didn't have a gun. So that's trying to use a scare tactic to get the audience to feel like I need to have a gun, right? And then change their mind to your side. Very weird to not be able to stop and ask if you have any questions. So I hope if you do have questions that you will email me or text me and let me know. All right, the final thing we're going to talk about in this lecture is the types of appeals. And there are many types of appeals. These are the three main ones. You might have learned about them in high school. And the appeals use evidence and examples to be established. So appeals use evidence and examples. And what I mean when I say appeals is, how do you appeal to your audience? So how do you make your message attractive? And obviously you use evidence and examples, but we want to put those evidence and examples into three different categories. And that's the categories that I'm going to talk to you about today, and also that are in your textbook. We are going to continue to rely heavily on these three appeals as we talk about rhetoric. So the first one we'll talk about is the appeal to logic, which is called logos. This is encouraging your audience to think through an idea in a logical manner. You might also use the common sense factor when you're trying to convince someone. And when you're using logos, you are providing facts and statistics. All right, so the way we talk about this in rhetoric is, let's say you are analyzing a speech for my class. You're going to look at that speech and try and find any references to statistics or facts or common sense that stick out to you as some sort of persuasive technique. So, for example, if I was doing a speech on sexual assault, I would definitely want to use the statistic that at least 1 in 6 women will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. That's a pretty strong statistic, especially if you're in a room full of women. You know, every 6th person is going to have some sort of sexual violence committed against them, statistically speaking. So that's where you can use logic and then follow it up with some sort of scenario, right? And a lot of times we're using these things to often make our audience feel fear, feel empathy, sadness, any sort of emotion that gets the audience member to change their mind. So you might use logos, which is logic, to get your audience to feel something through pathos. So pathos is an appeal to emotion. And the biggest example that I can give you, that all of you probably can picture, are the SPCA commercials with the animals who are starving and the Sarah McLachlan music in the background. All of that is specifically appealing to the audience emotion to try and do what? Raise money, right? So the appeal to emotion is information that draws on emotion. Super important part of convincing people of something, especially if they're more emotion minded or if the topic is more emotion related. You want to be careful about using pathos though, because you don't want to rely on just making your audience cry, right, to change their mind. You have to balance that with giving some logic or facts or statistics. And then the third appeal is the appeal to character or ethics, which is ethos. And that's where an author uses their own credibility or personal authority to convince you of something. So, for example, if we think about the rhetorical situation of me teaching you, I'm relying on you having trust in my credentials and my personal experience in order to listen to what I'm saying or believe what I'm saying, right? So, appeals to character aren't always specifically said. Like, I don't tell you to listen to me because I'm your professor. That's implied. So, a lot of times, ethos is an implied appeal. So, for example, if you go to church and you're listening to your pastor, your reverend, your religious leader, you're listening to them because of ethos, because of their ethos. They have personal authority to be up there speaking to you. Um, So, when an author, for example, if an author references credentials, like that they have a PhD from Harvard, that would be using ethos. Morality is also included, like an author's character. For example, you probably just trust that I have some sort of ethical beliefs as a teacher to grade you honestly and objectively. That would be also included with ethos, where we're talking about judgment of a person's character. Okay. And with that, it's where the speaker is relying on these things about themselves to convince the audience of something. So I rely on you believing in my credentials to listen to what I'm saying and to read my assignments and all of that stuff. And like I said, the ethos appeal can be implied. And, the example I'm giving is if you go to a religious service, the head speaker has some sort of credential to be speaking, and they are relying on that in order for the congregation or the gathering to listen to them, right? Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is the appeal to needs and values. And this appeals to the audience's basic human needs or common values. So, needs and values is going to be huge. Well, is huge right now. We've got an election coming up in November. So, you're going to see politicians beginning to state their common values that they have with their constituents and that they understand their audience's basic human needs. When we talk about basic human needs, remember we're talking about food, shelter, water. Sometimes we're talking about basic human needs emotionally. So, for example, I would say a basic human need is for happiness or contentment. So if you see that in a speech, if you see a speaker trying to convince an audience, like, hey, well, let's go with the religious aspect that I mentioned. If you have a speaker saying, you know, um, trust in the Lord for your basic human needs, for example, or trust in the Lord to provide, right? That's a big message in Christian. messaging is that the Lord will provide. So when we say something like that, we're trying to appeal to our audience's needs, right? Because if an audience member truly believes that a higher power is going to provide their needs, then they're going to go along with whoever is telling them that message, right? Another example would be common values for, I mentioned politics, common values that are heavily relied on in debates and elections are different ideas of what patriotism means and what it looks like. And so, more conservative leaning politicians are going to talk about that in a different way than more liberal leaning politicians, right? Okay, so that's kind of the meat of support. Remember, you have evidence and examples, and then you use evidence and examples to create appeals. And remember that appeals are ways that you manipulate your audience. And when we say things like manipulate, it manipulate has a negative connotation, but of course, if I'm trying to convince my kids of something, it's not like I'm negatively manipulating them. I'm trying to teach them, trying to communicate a message to them. But from another perspective, another parent might say you're manipulating them, right? So we want to understand that using all of these different things to communicate messages has lots of implications for other people who are analyzing your rhetoric, right? So we're going to practice analyzing rhetoric this week, specifically on a speech from Pope Francis, and I will post all of that information for you.